Hello. Right, we're going to focus on a different type of classification called phylogenetic classification, and the reason why this happens. So to get to that point, we're going to go through a definition of what phylogeny is and the reason for doing it, how it has changed the way we classify organisms. We're going to focus on a phylogenetic tree and look at what a clade is, and we're going to talk a bit about a protein called cytochrome C and the sequence of DNA and RNA and how they're helping us to put organisms into different categories. And then we'll also talk about something called convergent evolution. All right, so phylogeny is the study of evolutionary relationships between species. And what it does is it's hypothesizing that we are all a descendant of a common ancestor. So all organisms that exist on this planet right now, if you go back far enough in time, we're talking hundreds of millions of years, then we will all go back to something resembling some sort of unicellular organism. So this idea of phylogeny and the phylogenetic tree, this came in response to Darwin and the work he did when he produced The Origins of Species. So he suggested this mechanism of natural selection, and it prompted scientists to not just follow the Linnaean hierarchy system of kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. It still wanted to use them, that hierarchy, and that hasn't gone away. And in actual fact, it's got more complex. We've got the domain system now, so there's an extra level to it, but it wants to also acknowledge this concept of evolution and time. So it can be put together now, all these organisms, into something that looks like this, and this is a very small example of a phylogenetic tree because we've only got a handful of species here. And if you work your way to where the actual species are, this is present time. And if you go back, and because it's a phylogenetic tree, we can think of these as branches. As you go back from these end branches to the bigger branches, and we're working our way back and back and back towards the actual trunk, we're going back in time. And depending how far back this phylogenetic tree goes back, well, it gives us a sense of how many millions of years that we can go back. So one that we could look at here, if we look at a human and a chimpanzee, if we look at the story of humans, we've been evolving for about 1 million years from an ancestor here, and that ancestor we share with chimpanzees. So about 1 million years ago, we think we have diverged from chimpanzees. So, it's not 100% fact. This is still hypothesizing that we have evolved from a common ancestor with a chimpanzee. And the reason why we think that is because we share many features that are the same. And also, in more recent years, we've been able to study their genome or their DNA sequence, and over 98% of their DNA sequence is the same as ours. So lots in common. So let's look at the pigeon and the chicken. They're very closely related because they share a common ancestor, which they don't share with anyone else. The pigeon has one common ancestor with the chicken. So they are very closely related. And although the pigeon and the goose, they've got some similarities, not as much as the chicken, because the pigeon and the goose do not share a direct ancestor. We have to go further back, not here, but all the way back here. And if you're going back, and these are called nodes, by the way, as you go further back to the next node, you're going further and further back in time. So this point here, this could be representing millions of years. So the last time that a pigeon and a goose shared a common ancestor is millions and millions of years before the common ancestor that the pigeon and the chicken shared. So as you go further back, there's another common ancestor here. Now, what does the pigeon share a common ancestor with now? Well, not common, we have to go really far back. But at some point, if we go back far enough in time, the pigeon and the sheep share a common ancestor. So what has happened at these nodes? This is something we call this divergence of a species, where a change has occurred and this species now no longer exists, because just with natural selection, which we'll talk about later, has gone two different ways. Mutations have been successful one way and mutations have been successful another way. So different alleles have been successful, and as these different new species have evolved, they've evolved down completely different branches, and they've evolved again, more divergence. A clade, let's talk about that. This is a clade. A clade is a part of the phylogenetic tree where we can see where organisms share a common ancestor. So this is a small clade here. You could do a bigger clade. You could do, for example, if we make our way back 2 levels of the phylogenetic tree, we could call this a clade, but we're going back 2 ancestors. But all 3 of these are still sharing the same common ancestor here. And you could do that again, you can make it bigger and bigger. All right, let's talk about convergent evolution, because this can cause some confusion. And in response to this, we can study molecules such as cytochrome C or DNA or RNA, and this is helping us to be less subjective and more objective. So if you imagine back in the 18th century, where they're just starting to try and change the Linnaean system to try and incorporate the concept of evolution, and they rather just putting groups into, you know, oh, this is this genus and this is this family or order or class. Now they're trying to figure out what ancestors might they most closely resemble, which ones should put close together. And they might have come across these things, oh, here's a marsupial mole, an American mole, and they've got really similar features. They've got this hard nose to help them burrow. They've got a round body, cylindrical body, to help them to burrow down into the ground. They've got these tiny little eyes, can't see much. They've got these claws. So, you know, you wouldn't blame them for thinking maybe they shared a common ancestor. So let's just make these letters. Let's just call this species A and species B. Just by the way they look, you might say that they had a common ancestor, and at some point they diverged and became slightly different species. But in actual fact, if you look at the phylogenetic tree on these species, there is our marsupial mole, and there's our American. And the marsupial mole, it's much closer related to the kangaroo, because that's the common ancestor there. There's the node. And in order to find out the common ancestor, the ancestor for the marsupial mole and the American mole, we've got to go all the way back here. And as you go further back, you're going back further in time. We're talking millions and millions of years extra time. And that's given much more time for more mutations and more changes. So in actual fact, if we look at how the American mole, how its evolution from its ancestor diverged in a different way through different mutations, it's much more reasonable to say that the American mole and the polar bear are more similar, or the American mole and the brown bear have got more in common, even though these two moles look the same. And we call this convergent evolution. Convergent evolution, it's not divergent. This is divergent evolution, where they've broken off from a common ancestor. Convergent is where two features look the same and appear to be all the same, but actually they've come from completely different ancestors in the recent time. I know if you go back far enough, we all will start off with that same species, but you can see here, this has come from this species here, if we call this C, and this has come from D. It's just a coincidence that they've ended up looking the same. And it's not a complete surprise that they look the same. They share a similar niche. They're found underground, so it's no surprise they've ended up that way. And that's happened with bats and whales as well. They don't have, you'd have to go very far back for them to have an ancestor that they share. But because of the fact that the bat's found in dark caves and the whale is found deep underwater, it's pretty dark, they have both evolved to have this echolocation, another form of convergent evolution. Right, so we've talked about the definition of phylogeny and how it's this hypothesis that we all have evolved from the same common ancestor, some sort of unicellular organism, if you go back hundreds of millions of years. We've discussed this phylogenetic tree and what a clade is. All right, so the reason, I can't remember if I've mentioned this now, but the reason why we know that these two organisms do not come from the same common ancestor is because we're now able to study their DNA. We can study the molecules found in their cells, such as cytochrome C, and what we've realized, what we can see is there are big differences in their DNA sequence. There's, it makes no sense that these two could be considered to have a close ancestor when their DNA sequence is so different, and the marsupial mole and the kangaroo is so similar. So we can't just do it just based on looks. It's becoming less subjective and much more objective. We can just look at the DNA and go, right, these are similar, these aren't. All right, so in summary, phylogeny is the study of the evolutionary history of a group of related organisms. It is represented by a phylogenetic tree. A clade is a group of organisms that includes an ancestor and all of its descendants. Studying DNA and RNA sequences and molecules such as cytochrome C, there should be an R there, has made the process of classification more objective. Make sure you're looking through your textbook. There's a lot of information here. Don't just rely on just this video, and don't forget to answer the essay question in the description.